The man on the other end of the 911 call sounded surprisingly calm, not because he wasn't scared, but because he couldn't understand what had happened to him. He told the dispatcher he had just woken up to find a devastating wound across his abdomen. Now he was lying in bed, desperately trying to hold himself together with one hand while clutching the phone with the other.
3900 Toro Canyon Road, hurry. My captain just jumped out of my stomach. We're out of my stomach.
If you enjoy true crime stories that peel back every layer of a case instead of just telling you what happened, consider subscribing. Every week, we dive into real cases where the truth is often stranger than fiction. On the evening of October 1st, 1999, 75-year-old Steve Beard was sitting on the patio of his home in Austin, Texas, enjoying a quiet drink. Inside, his wife Celeste was finishing the dishes while the two of them looked forward to a 3-week vacation across Europe, scheduled to begin in just a couple of days. To anyone looking in from the outside, they seemed happy, and Steve genuinely believed they were. After losing his first wife of 45 years to cancer, he never expected to fall in love again. Her death had left a hole in his life that nothing seemed capable of filling. Friends remembered him how withdrawn he became, often spending evenings alone at the country club, more out of habit than enjoyment. That's where he met Celeste. She worked there as a waitress, and despite the nearly 40-year age gap between them, the two quickly formed a connection. Within a little over a year, they were married. Many people questioned the relationship. Steve was a successful businessman and former television executive worth millions of dollars, while Celeste was raising twin teenage daughters and struggling to rebuild her life. Some quietly wondered whether she loved Steve or simply the security he offered. Steve never paid much attention to those opinions. He believed he'd found someone who made life feel hopeful again. Looking back, that hope would ultimately become his greatest blind spot. The year hadn't been easy for either of them. Earlier that year, Celeste had a serious mental health crisis and spent several weeks receiving treatment in a psychiatric hospital. It was a difficult time for the entire family, but afterward she seemed different, in the best possible way. Her medication had changed, she'd made new friends during treatment, and she appeared to be moving forward. Steve wanted to believe the hardest days were behind them. But while Celeste seemed to be recovering, Steve's own health had become increasingly difficult to explain. Over the previous few months, he had collapsed several times without warning. Doctors diagnosed high blood pressure, sleep apnea, and heart and kidney conditions, yet none of those conditions fully explained why he kept passing out. The episodes puzzled his doctors. Steve, however, wasn't overly concerned. He assumed stress was catching up with him, and he hoped their upcoming vacation would give both of them the chance to slow down and reset. At the time, it seemed a reasonable explanation. Later, investigators would wonder if those unexplained episodes had been trying to tell a very different story.
Later that evening, Steve walked back to the bedroom to check that everything was ready for the trip. His suitcase had been packed days earlier. Celeste's was still sitting in the closet, empty. When he found her in the kitchen, he gently reminded her that they would be leaving soon. She smiled and told him not to worry. She'd been busy and would get around to packing later. Steve accepted the answer, though something about it lingered in the back of his mind. It wasn't an argument or even a disagreement, just one of those small moments that seems ordinary until much later. Around 9 o'clock, feeling unusually tired, Steve decided to turn in early. Celeste told him she planned to stay up a little longer. One of her daughters was spending the night at the family's lake house with friends, and she wanted to drive over and check on them before coming home. To avoid waking Steve when she returned, she said she'd sleep in one of the guest bedrooms. Steve thanked her, kissed her goodnight, and headed down the hall. He changed into his pajamas, fitted his oxygen mask for his sleep apnea, and was asleep within minutes. The house grew quiet. Outside, nothing seemed out of place. Sometime around 3 in the morning, Steve was jolted awake by an intense pain in his abdomen. Still half asleep, he couldn't make sense of it. At first, he thought it might be another medical episode. Then he reached down. His hand came back wet. Confused, he leaned toward the bedside lamp and switched it on. For a moment, he simply stared. Blood covered the sheets, his pajamas, his hands, his stomach. Only then did he realize the source of the pain. A massive wound had torn through his abdomen, and he could see that his injuries were far worse than anything he could comprehend. He shouted for Celeste, once, then again. The house remained silent. Trying to ignore the pain, Steve grabbed the phone from the bedside table and dialed 911.
3900, Toro Canyon Road, hurry. My captain just jumped out of my stomach. They blew out of my stomach.
Okay, sir, how did
Awful pain.
this happen?
There's nothing. I've been sleeping. I didn't woke up.
Okay, are you there by yourself?
My wife is somewhere in the house. I can't find her.
As he waited for someone to answer, he pressed one hand against the wound, doing everything he could to keep himself alive. He still had no idea what had happened. Within minutes, deputies from the Travis County Sheriff's Office arrived at the Beard residence. The emergency call had been confusing. Dispatchers knew a man inside the house had suffered catastrophic injuries, but they still didn't know how. The officers knocked repeatedly at the front door. No answer. With every passing second, they knew the man inside was losing blood. Deputy Alan Howard decided they couldn't wait any longer. He circled the house, searching for another way inside. What he found a few moments later would completely change the direction of the case. At first, this looked like a medical emergency. Within minutes, investigators would realize they were standing inside the scene of a carefully planned attack.
Deputy Alan Howard eventually found a staircase leading up to a small patio outside one of the bedrooms. Through the glass door, he could see the lights were on. And there, lying on the bed, was Steve. One hand held the telephone receiver against his ear. The other was pressed tightly against his stomach. Even from outside, Howard could see there was blood everywhere. The door was locked. Without wasting another second, he smashed the glass, reached inside to unlock it, and rushed into the room. Steve was still conscious, barely. Howard knelt beside the bed and immediately understood why the dispatcher had struggled to make sense of the call. Steve's injuries were unlike anything he'd seen before. He was desperately trying to hold his intestines in place while fighting to stay awake. Trying to remain calm, Howard leaned closer. "Steve, can you tell me who did this?" Steve looked at him with the same confusion he'd expressed over the phone. I don't know. I was asleep." There was no anger in his voice, no accusation, just genuine disbelief. For investigators, victims often provide the first real clue, but Steve couldn't point them toward a suspect because, as far as he knew, there wasn't one. He had gone to bed expecting an ordinary night and woken up in the middle of a nightmare. As paramedics worked to stabilize Steve, Howard took a careful look around the bedroom. Nothing immediately stood out until he noticed something small lying on the carpet near the foot of the bed. It was a yellow shotgun shell. He bent down for a closer look. There was no mistaking it. Whatever had happened in this room, it hadn't been an accident. Someone had fired a shotgun at a sleeping man, then disappeared before anyone else in the house seemed to notice. That realization changed everything. If the shooter had entered the home, there was no guarantee they had already left. Howard quietly drew his weapon and stepped into the hallway. The mansion was silent. He cleared each room one by one, listening for movement, expecting at any moment to come face to face with whoever pulled the trigger. Instead, he found something entirely different. In one of the guest bedrooms, a woman stirred as Howard switched on the light. It was Celeste. Startled awake, she looked at the deputy in confusion before noticing the urgency on his face. Howard quickly identified himself and explained that Steve had been seriously injured. The color drained from her face. She immediately began crying, pleading with the officers not to let her husband die. Moments later, one of her teenage daughters rushed into the room, equally confused by the commotion. The two embraced as they tried to make sense of what was happening around them. To Howard, their reactions seemed genuine. They looked exactly like a family blindsided by tragedy. Still, appearances alone couldn't answer the questions that mattered. Who had entered the house? How had they gotten in? And, more importantly, why Steve?
By sunrise, Detective Paul Knight had taken over the case. Steve had survived emergency surgery, but his condition was still too critical for questioning. That meant the investigation would have to begin with the people closest to him. Knight's first conversation was with Celeste. She calmly walked him through the previous evening. Steve had gone to bed around 9 o'clock, just as he'd planned. Afterward, she drove to the lake house to check on one of her daughters, who was spending the night there with friends. By the time she returned home, it was close to midnight. Not wanting to wake Steve, she said she slept in a guest room. She told the story clearly. Nothing about it immediately raised alarms. Before asking anything else, Knight performed a routine gunshot residue test on both Celeste and her daughter Christina. Both tests came back negative. Neither of them had recently fired a gun. For the moment, that ruled out the possibility that either woman had pulled the trigger themselves, but it didn't rule out something else. In cases involving family, detectives learn very quickly that pulling the trigger and planning the crime are often two very different things. As the morning went on, more family members and friends arrived at the hospital. Knight spoke with Steve's stepdaughters one at a time, asking the same question he'd already asked everyone else. Can you think of anyone who would want to hurt Steve? Both sisters exchanged a quick glance before answering. Tracy Tarleton. It was the first time Knight had heard the name. A few minutes later, two of the girls' boyfriends arrived. Without hearing the earlier conversation, they mentioned Tracy as well. Then another teenage friend arrived from the lake house. She hadn't been present for any of the interviews. When Knight asked the same question, she gave the exact same answer: Tracy.
The consistency was impossible to ignore. 5 different people, 5 identical answers. Most detectives would have considered that a breakthrough. Knight wasn't so sure. It wasn't unusual for several people to suspect the same person. What caught his attention was how quickly they all reached the same conclusion, as though none of them had considered anyone else. Later that afternoon, Knight drove to a modest home on the other side of Austin. It belonged to Tracy Tarleton. He didn't know yet whether she'd committed the crime, but before the day was over, he'd learned 2 things about her that made the investigation far more complicated. She was one of Celeste's closest friends, and she owned a 20-gauge shotgun, the same caliber used to shoot Steve Beard. It didn't happen all at once. One clue led to another, then another, until the investigation quietly began to shift. Before long, detectives realized they were asking a completely different question than the one they'd started with. When Detective Paul Knight arrived at Tracy Tarleton's home, he wasn't sure what to expect. By that point, several people had already pointed to her as the obvious suspect. If they were right, he was about to question the woman responsible for nearly killing Steve Beard. Instead, he was greeted by someone who seemed surprisingly cooperative. Tracy invited the detectives inside and answered every question they asked. She admitted she and Celeste had become close friends after meeting during treatment at a psychiatric hospital earlier that year. During that friendship, she said, she'd developed romantic feelings for Celeste. Those feelings, she explained, weren't returned. Or, at least, that's what she wanted detectives to believe. When Knight asked if she owned a shotgun, Tracy didn't hesitate. She led them to a 20-gauge shotgun and handed it over voluntarily. It was the same caliber used in the attack. Even so, something didn't sit right with Knight. People guilty of violent crimes don't always panic or run, but Tracy's willingness to cooperate didn't match the picture everyone else had painted of her. It was another piece of the puzzle, not the whole picture. While forensic testing was underway, Knight returned to the Beard residence. If someone had broken into the house, there had to be signs of it. At first glance, one of the bedrooms looked exactly as you'd expect after a burglary. Drawers had been pulled open, clothes were scattered across the floor, and belongings were strewn around the room. But the longer Knight stood there, the less convincing it looked. Expensive jewelry had been left behind. Electronics hadn't been touched. Nothing of real value appeared to be missing. It looked less like a burglary, and more like someone's idea of what a burglary should look like. Then another detail caught his attention. Steve's wedding ring and wristwatch were gone. It seemed odd. If the attack had happened while Steve was asleep, why would the intruder take the time to remove personal items from his body instead of escaping? The scene wasn't adding up. Sometimes it's not the evidence investigators find that changes a case. It's the evidence that doesn't make sense. Before leaving the house, Knight searched one last area that hadn't received much attention: the attic. Hidden among the insulation, he found another 20-gauge shotgun. The discovery immediately raised new questions. Who put it there, and why hide one shotgun when another had already been recovered? When detectives asked Celeste's daughter Jennifer about it, she admitted she'd hidden the gun after finding it in the garage. She said she was afraid police might think it had been used in the shooting. It was an explanation, but it didn't explain everything. With every interview, the case seemed to grow more complicated. Days later, Knight went to the hospital hoping to speak with Steve. He had survived the surgery, but only just. The attack had left him critically injured, and doctors weren't sure if he'd recover. Before Knight could ask a single question, Steve's attorney stepped in. On Steve's behalf, he declined the interview. It wasn't unusual for victims to wait until they were stronger before speaking with police. What caught Knight's attention was Celeste. She seemed unusually determined to keep detectives away from her husband. On its own, it wasn't enough to prove anything, but it was another small detail Knight couldn't ignore. It didn't happen all at once. One clue led to another, then another, until the investigation quietly began to shift. Before long, detectives realized they were asking a completely different question than the one they'd started with. They were no longer asking who fired the shotgun. They were beginning to ask who had the most to gain. The answer finally came from the crime lab. Ballistics testing confirmed that the pellets removed from Steve's body had been fired from Tracy Tarleton's shotgun. It was the break investigators had been waiting for. Tracy was arrested and charged with attempted murder. At first, she denied everything, but faced with the evidence, her story slowly began to unravel. She admitted she'd been the one who'd pulled the trigger. What she told detectives next changed the entire case. Tracy confessed that she and Celeste weren't simply friends. They had been having a secret romantic relationship. According to Tracy, Celeste had spent months convincing her that Steve controlled every part of her life. She claimed she was trapped in an unhappy marriage and couldn't leave because of his money and influence. Over time, those conversations became something darker. Celeste allegedly began talking about a future where the two of them could finally be together. A future that, according to Tracy, couldn't happen while Steve was still alive. Detectives would later learn that Steve's unexplained collapses before the shooting may not have been medical episodes after all. Investigators believed Celeste had been secretly mixing Everclear into his drinks, hoping to weaken him over time without raising suspicion. When that failed, the plan escalated. Steve Beard survived the shooting that October morning, but the damage to his body was devastating. 4 months later, he died from complications related to his injuries. For his family, it marked the end of a long and painful fight. For investigators, it confirmed they were no longer dealing with attempted murder. It was now a homicide case. Tracy eventually pled guilty and agreed to testify against Celeste, describing years of emotional manipulation and the promises she'd been led to believe. Prosecutors argued that while Tracy had fired the gun, Celeste had orchestrated the crime from the beginning. A jury agreed. Celeste Beard was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison. Tracy received a reduced sentence in exchange for her cooperation and was later released on parole. Steve Beard spent the last years of his life believing he'd been given a second chance at happiness. Instead, the person he trusted most was quietly building a future that no longer included him. In the end, detectives didn't solve this case because of one dramatic breakthrough. They solved it the same way most investigations are solved, one small truth at a time, until the lies could no longer hold together. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more true crime cases where the smallest detail often turns out to be the one that changes everything.